Welcome to the PRovoke Media Podcast. I'm Megan Keogan, host of today's episode and head of content partnerships here at PRovoke. As the number of multicultural groups continues to grow, the need for agencies and brands to think differently about how they engage with these distinctive audiences is ever more important. To gain a deeper understanding of multiculturalism today, Zeno Group and their partner agency, EGAMI Group, have conducted a large-scale study to underscore this very topic. With us today are Teneshia Warner and Therese Caruso. Thank you both for being here with us and really looking forward to learning more about this subject.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Teneshia, since we've heard first from you, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your role at EGAMI Group and kick us off here.
Absolutely. And again, just thank you so much for having us back again to the PRovoke community. We, Zeno Group, as well as EGAMI, we are not strangers. We have loved the partnership with the community. So I am Teneshia Jackson Warner. I am the founder and CEO of EGAMI Group, meaning I've been there since day one. The agency recently celebrated 15 years, and we're headquartered in New York, and we are a multicultural integrated communications agency. What that means is on a day-to-day basis, we're working with Fortune 50, Fortune 100 brands in supporting them to reach multicultural audiences. My role as the founder is definitely leading the vision of the firm. Still very much so connected to the client work. It brings me joy. So supporting from a strategy standpoint. And then I'm also responsible for the vision and growth of the firm, which is a huge part of the reason why we formed a strategic alliance with our partner, Zeno Group, and you all will hear more about that. And we have just enjoyed the partnership with Zeno Group that dates back now almost a year and a half.
And I'm Therese Caruso. It's a pleasure to be here as well. I lead strategy and planning at Zeno Group, and I'm very proud to be representing our agency today with Teneshia to talk to you about this very important research that we did on multiculturalism in America. I've been studying different audiences for the better part of my career. My partner in research always says, Therese, you're a real student of humanity. And I really believe that I am. At Zeno Group, we have an IP called the Human Project, and it's part research, part methodology. We help our clients to understand the core values of all the audiences that they desire to reach. And today, Megan, 70% of people globally demand that the brands that they buy, that the companies that they work for mirror their most personal core values. So in order for companies to be successful in this endeavor, in this pursuit, they have to know what those values are. And Teneshia and I are going to talk to you about what are the values of all the multicultural groups in America. We know them because we actually asked 40 values, all these 6,000 people we talked to rank the values. So I focus very much on that at Zeno Group and help our clients to make these important connections because the world has changed today. And I think every brand out there and every company out there needs to understand how to connect with people on a very human level.
Thank you both. As our listeners can probably assess, there's a lot of enthusiasm on this subject. We have a lot to unpack today. And I do really believe that everyone listening here is going to take away some really key takeaways and some really important information. And thank you both for leading the research on this. Thank you both for bringing it to us today. Without further ado, I think we should jump in. Let's start with a little bit of background on this partnership, how you came to be together, especially on this particular research topic. And I think, Therese, you might be the best person to take us there.
Actually, I think Teneshia is going to answer this question on the partnership.
So, Megan, I'll take us back to the history and then I'll kick
Yes.
it.
Okay.
So the history behind the partnership, I think if everyone were to think back to May of 2020, that was during the period where George Floyd was murdered. it was definitely a moment in time globally that so many companies and industries had a global awakening that it was time to do more and do something, and even explore like what should our role look like to drive change. One of the things that the PR industry sort of walked away with in that moment is, you know what, we are not diverse enough. We need to really up our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And so it was during this period that, you know, many people and many agencies and organizations were really looking at the proposed solutions through numbers only. Like, how can we increase and make our numbers better? Which that is a very, very important measurement and KPI to look at. However, you know, for myself as founder of EGAMI Group and then Zeno's CEO, Barbie, we got together during this period and said, you know, can we create something that even goes beyond the numbers, something that hasn't been done before, and something that can serve as a new model for collaboration for change? And that really was the premise behind Zeno Group and EGAMI Group forming this strategic alliance. And inside of this strategic alliance, number one, Zeno took a vested interest in EGAMI Group, and we really decided, how can we partner together to drive impact in 4 different areas? First is people within our organizations. We wanted to create models that would support people of color in growing in this industry, as well as attracting them. The second was clients. How do we partner with our clients to support them in reaching the new mass market, the new face of our nation? The third thing was, how do we serve as leaders within our industry around bringing thought leadership to the table that will push us forward? And last but not least, how do we do great work that will actually leave meaningful impact in the world? So those were the 4 areas that we knew we wanted to focus on. I feel that in year 1, we really started heavily from the inside with our people first, building integrated teams, professional development. And then secondly, from that, we also really zoned in on our clients. We started to build integrated teams and deliver solutions for some of our leading clients together, and that's going extremely well. But as we entered into the 1.5 year mark, we knew, okay, it's time now to really, really take a leadership role from a thought leadership perspective, as well as a role in supporting our clients in reaching the new mass market. And that's where this research comes in. It's really research to increase the knowledge of our clients in the area of cultural competency so that they are positioned to reach the new faces and voices that are rising within our nation. So I gave you all the tea and the juice to the backstory, but I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Therese, but that's really the history behind the partnership and the why behind this particular research.
No, I mean, you said it so beautifully, Teneshia. I mean, the only thing that I would add is that in being a strategic planner and working with clients on a day-to-day basis, this is so necessary now, even more than it was before. And we're going to talk about why in a minute, because some of the insights that we derived from this research really do point to a better understanding for our clients and our whole community that we work with of this audience at this moment in time. So that's the only thing that I want to add, and it's going to come to life as we start talking about this research.
Absolutely. So just as we lay some of that foundational work of how we got here, can we talk just for a moment about the methodology, who we polled, how you interviewed, how the data came to be, how it came to fruition?
Sure, absolutely. So we did an online survey of 6,000 respondents, which is quite pervasive. And the reason why there are so many respondents is because when we sat down with EGAMI initially, we were going to focus on one very specific audience that we had a hunch about. And what EGAMI counseled us on is we had to talk to traditional multicultural groups, as well as to uncover any new groups that are coming forward with multiculturalism. So that's why we went to 6,000 people, because essentially we cut across the following groups. We always look at Gen Pop because we want to make sure that we have a comparative against Gen Pop. So we looked at Gen Pop, Black and Hispanic and Latino, Asian American and Pacific Islander audiences, multi-ethnic, and we're going to take a very, very deep look at multi-ethnic because that is sort of the new group that we uncovered, LGBTQ plus. Those are the audiences, and we did the survey in English and Spanish.
Thank you. And I think one really interesting takeaway, which or kind of observation, which we will focus a lot on here, is how you were able to uncover an entirely new like demographic or population within this. And that was one of the things that, to me, in getting to review and preview some of this research, has stood out the most. Like it's one thing to be able to tap what we know, and a whole other thing to be able to identify what's the next step or the future of where we take our marketing and messaging and speaking and engaging with different audiences.
I'd actually like to speak to that, Megan, because one important note here is that when we do research, I think we do it in a really unique way at Zeno Group, because we have strategic planning and research in one area. It's sort of it's embedded in one area of focus for us as an agency. And so what that allowed us to do with this research is we did our due diligence before we even put pen to paper on the questionnaire. And we did a deep analytics exercise to see what's been covered already, what's already out there, so that we know that we don't need to cover it because everybody knows certain things, but what hasn't been covered. And we had a hunch going into this because we're always doing research on different audiences. We had a hunch that the youngest segment that can be studied, 18 plus, essentially Gen Zs, are changing the face of multiculturalism because of who they are and because of this multi-ethnic group. And they're very influential and they're rising in numbers. They're the fastest growing group in the United States. They've risen to 10% of our population, which is quite big. So we studied in our analytics exercise before we even began, is this group being studied? We found the answer to be no. And how do we reach them on a very deep level through our questionnaire and to understand them better? So when you say, yes, we defined a new generation, that was a very big goal going in because of our analytics and because of what we knew before we actually started writing the questionnaire.
Thank you. And I have one further question to kind of build on that, if you don't mind. And that is, Teneshia, when you were speaking about sort of the George Floyd moment and that 2020 moment or time frame being when you and Barbie really thought like there's more to be done here. I'm interested if, and maybe your research didn't go here, and I apologize, but if the hunch that you had that there was this, we know there's something we don't know out there, if that growth or hunch coincided with that 2020 moment, or if it was already underway prior to kind of the shift in our worldly awareness of.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it was so already underway.
Yeah.
I think, and I'm gonna turn it over to Teneshia, but I can just say from a research standpoint and from a generational standpoint, it was absolutely already there and inherent in the Gen Z generation. I mean, they're changing the face of just about everything. So, but I'll turn it over to Teneshia as well to answer that question.
Yeah, I think when we started, here's what we knew. We knew that multicultural audiences were the fastest growing audience and on track to become the majority by the year of 2045. We knew that this is a population that's spending more than 65 billion each year with an influence and upward of over 1 trillion in total consumer spending. And we also knew that our industry, as it relates to communicating to diverse audiences, is way behind where we should be in speaking to these diverse audiences. We're still receiving briefs that are, really poised to meet general market, and really general market, that should be a term that should be expired, because general market is multicultural and multicultural is general market. But the briefs will be written in a way where we want to reach moms, or we want to reach, general market dads. And there's no reference or pull through of the diversity and the complexity of diverse audiences in our nation. And Byron, he is one of the lead partners out of the New York office. He's the managing director of Zeno East. He oftentimes talk about the brief actually approaches multicultural with the bolt on. And oh yeah, we want to reach a sub target of African-American women, really treating it as an afterthought. And so what we knew going into this is that the industry needed to catch up and create new innovative ways if we're going to be partners with our clients in reaching this fast growing demographic. I think what we're now intrigued in finding out is some of the things that this research has really showcased now, that yes, in addition to reaching multicultural diverse audiences, you got to even now understand the nuances and complexities that go within that. And we were very pleased to identify this new fast growing group that we are calling Generation Self-Defined. And so I'll be quiet now and see if there's even more questions. As you can tell, we're really excited to.
No, that's great. It's exactly what we want. Thank you for answering that and for helping our audience better understand as we move through this. So we've kind of talked about key findings. We've talked about the methodology. Anything else that we want to add to that before we move on?
I think we're excited to kind of talk about some of the key takeaways. Well, tell me this, Therese, do you want to maybe, before we talk about the key takeaways, just give some of the high level of some of the things that we discovered, the values, and then for our listeners, we'll kind of sum this up in like, what does that mean for you in terms of the key takeaways?
Sure. I mean, I think what I'd like to maybe first start with is that what we found from this research is that identity in the United States is really being called sort of into question here. And the reason is that every day people are looking at their identity in a very serious way. And they're kind of building their point of view in life and what's important to them based on who they are and what their ethnic and racial makeup is. It's becoming so much more important and so much more, in the public eye now. So that is a very, very important kind of finding. The second is that this new group that we discovered is really changing the face of America in that it used to be that brands could look out over the landscape and see what is the world of pop culture like. What is pop culture today? What is on the minds of people in culture and society? I would commit right here that pop culture is kind of gone and dead, and that has to do with identity and how these audiences are trying different things on a daily basis so that they can live their most fulfilled lives. And so I think brands and marketers need to watch carefully how these audiences are living their lives and what's most important to them, because their influence is unprecedented and sort of unparalleled to what we've seen. And Teneshia did give the numbers of how this audience is growing and their sort of their market kind of value and what brands need to know about them. And the last thing I'll just say before we get into the imperatives is that what's alarming, what we found with this youngest generation, the Gen Zs, essentially, that we defined as generation self-defined, is their multi-ethnic backgrounds are causing them to have big challenges in life. Because if they're Black, Hispanic, and Asian, embodied in one person, they don't feel Black enough in the Black community. They don't feel Hispanic enough in the Hispanic community, and so on and so forth. So there's a very big role here for companies to rethink the way they're engaging these audiences to ensure that these young people actually do feel a sense of community and meet them where they are, given their backgrounds and the dynamism that this group actually brings to the United States. We need to look at this differently.
And a question for you, just sort of a follow-up there. When we talk about Gen Z and generation self-defined, it does seem like there's quite a bit of overlap. Can you just sort of expand a bit on that, just to clarify for our listeners where
Yes.
that overlap is and the difference there?
I could say it very simply, Megan. I mean, generation self-defined is Gen Z. And if I've done so many focus groups with Gen Zs, and when I have them in the room and I say to them, you guys are Gen Z, they sort of look at me like I'm crazy, and they say, we wish we didn't have that moniker. Please stop using, we don't want to be Z. So that's why, and we debated back and forth with Teneshia a lot on this, like, what is the name of this group? Like, how do we define this group? And it's very hard to define them because, again, what I said is, like, every day they're dynamically kind of proclaiming who they are through their beautiful backgrounds. And so they really are self-defining themselves every day. So how can we call them Gen Z? Like, we really should be articulating who they are through a different way in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. When we look at these findings and takeaways, any surprises that came up that were completely outside of what the hypotheses or hunches were that you'd learn?
I mean, I could say the biggest surprise for me was the tremendous influence that these youngest multi-ethnic groups have over generations before them, Gen Alpha, which is our youngest generation. We know that Gen Alpha, if you say to them, who's your hero? They'll say, oh, the 18-year-old in my high school that just started a company in her basement, or, they'll say a 23-year-old on TikTok that's, defining the new face of food, or beauty, or so the youngest generation is very much looking up to the generation self-defined, but also just how much they don't feel like they're real members of society. That was surprising, and how lonely and disconnected this generation feels, even though they're so connected through their technology, they still sort of feel a sense of loneliness and ill belonging. And that's surprising, but it's also alarming. And it's a note to marketers and brands out there. What a big opportunity for our brands across different industries to leverage the influence and the enthusiasm of this new group, but also other groups. I don't want to just say that we only focused on Gen Z, because we absolutely did not, but everyone's sort of looking at this generation and their influence, and they're kind of mirroring the hopes and fears of this new generation. Teneshia, did you have some surprises?
I think the biggest surprise for me is the fact that this group, this multi-ethnic, multiracial group, is now representing 10% of the population, and is indeed one of the fastest growing segments in the US. So of course, you heard me say some of the stats around multicultural audiences becoming the majority by the year 2045. However, I do not think we realize that this multi-ethnic, multiracial group was the fastest growing within those multicultural audiences, which kind of implies from a brand perspective or even from an organization perspective, we really even have to take a deeper look at what does it mean to engage diverse audiences. And some of those things, just a few of the takeaways, is number one, identity is increasingly complex, multi-layered, and nuanced. So you hear us say this, but like never before, there cannot be a one size fits all definition when we start thinking about identity. We really have to think about sexual orientation, gender identity, disabilities, and differing outlooks on the world. And how is this a part of sort of the fabric of what makes up individual identity, alongside some of those traditional signifiers such as race and culture. And so for companies and brands, it's going to require us to take a deeper dive beneath the surface in reaching and speaking to these audiences in relevant ways. When Therese talks about them not necessarily feeling as if they belong in any one group, like they're not Black enough or not Hispanic enough, that is a cultural insight. And if you're listening to this, you may be able to relate, especially if you are coming from a diverse background. That's a cultural insight that I feel I've been aware of just in hearing younger people say, you know, I am multi-ethnic, but you know, when I go to the family reunion on my Black side, I kind of feel that I'm overproving my Blackness there. And or you know, when I am with my other side of the family, I have to also overcompensate here. And there's this sense of like, where do I really belong? I think that's a cultural insight and tension that we can really dive into, because if this group is the fastest growing group, but they're not feeling seen, heard, or understood, we're missing the mark. We have to now create ways to show to this fast growing group, we see you and we acknowledge you. And I think that's going to leave a lot of opportunity for brands and companies. The second key takeaway here is really, really embracing representation, resonance, and relevance, and pulling that through in our work, and not just in some of the industries that are making progress when it comes to reaching multicultural groups like beauty, sports, media, and fashion. But there's still significant work to be done in other vital industries such as healthcare or education, insurance, food and nutrition, banking and finance. How do we ensure that there is that representation, resonance, and relevance, that these audiences are definitely feeling seen, heard, and understood? The third key takeaway here is, in a world where, you know, these audiences, they realize they are the fastest growing, and they realize we do have the buying power. And they also realize that within this recent global awakening, many brands are now saying, okay, well, how do we reach you? I think it's very important that from a brand or company perspective, you can engage these audiences thinking, how do I sell my product, or what's in it for me only? It has to also come with a desire to understand the audience, their values, their hopes, their fears, understand the societal issues impacting these communities, and also understanding what role can your company and or organization play in showing these groups of audiences, not only do we see you, but we care about you, and we're making an effort to understand what creates your reality in the world. And in those spaces where your reality in the world is not fair, you know, what is going to be our part and role in sort of tackling some of these societal issues? So a huge opportunity for us to also go deeper and not just take an approach of what's in it for me to reach these audiences to sell, but really, really build long-term empathetic relationships with these communities to say, we want to show you that we care about what you care about for the long term.
You've teed up my kind of next question really well, which is how do we do this authentically? How do you put this to work? You know, like the findings are really important and they're essential, but what does it look like when we start to apply this?
I can speak to some of this. I think the first thing that we always tell our clients is, do you know who these people are at their core? And the only real way to know who they are at their core is to know what their values are, is to know what guides them in life, so that you can speak to them with relevance and authenticity. And I have to say that, you know, a lot of big brands, of course, they understand who their target audiences are. And a lot of them do very, very big studies on who they are. But we do find that most of them don't really know the values that are driving them forward. And that's kind of the most important piece. So I just want to make a note here that we did find, very interestingly, that when you look at values across all the audiences, Black, you know, Hispanic, all the audiences that I mentioned that we actually studied, all of their values are different. Not vastly different, but they put them in a different order. So some of the top values that we found that are most important to this group are values like honesty, freedom, protecting the family, equality, self-reliance, knowledge. Very, very interesting values that are different than Gen Pop. But when it really gets nuanced, and here's where this research really, I think, will help companies. Where it gets nuanced is the order, is the ranking of the values by the different audiences. Because if you know that the top 5 values for one audience are different than another audience, you're going to really understand what the nuances are and what the differences are, and how you need to speak to them, how you need to engage them through marketing and even product development. What's important from a product development standpoint, if you know what's the most important values and the attitudes that drive these people. So this research, we actually tested and put in front of them 40 values, and that's based on research. We didn't just choose the values out of a vacuum. And then we took those values and we asked each of these 6,000 people to rank the 40 values. And then we looked at those. And so if a marketer says to us, Megan, so what if we want to reach all the audiences at the same time? You know, how do we do that? So here's where the sort of tool comes in. You can look at the shared values across all the audiences. You can look at the differentiated values, but we also ask what's rising. So we could look in a crystal ball and say, what's going to be important to you, do you think, over the next 2 years? So we even have the rising values that we see to start coming through. So that's one way to engage them, absolutely. And then the other way that we did, and our research uncovered this as well, is we came up with 5 imperatives for brands wanting to reach this fastest growing group of generation self-defined, which is essentially Gen Z. So I would love to kind of go through these imperatives, because I think they might be really helpful for brands, to anyone that's watching this. And we got these imperatives based on the research. And again, these are the imperatives to reach this very influential, fastest growing group in the United States. So the number one imperative that we found, and actually these really aren't in order, these are just all the imperatives that we found, is that you can't really focus on surface level physical attributes, you know, as the primary access to communication. And that is the way most brands have focused on this. You can't really do that with a multi-ethnic group, because some of them have 4 or 5 different ethnicities. So what we need to do is brands need to embrace their entire identity. And also that includes their approach to family and home and work, and how they express their authenticity through things like beauty and fashion and even food, you know, and their interests, their hobbies, their careers. What is their purpose in life? And we have all these data points embedded, you know, in the research. So that's sort of like the first big imperative. The second one is to engage Generation Self-Defined as almost like a true reference and a guide for culture and society today, and enlist them as advocates and sounding boards, both internally at a company. There's 4 generations now in the workplace. That's the first time this has ever happened. And this generation is in the workplace now as the youngest generation and influencing others. So they are driving the trends across every vertical, and they're influencing all generations, as I said. So I think it's important to understand who these people are, and how to kind of invest in them as references and real guides for culture. The third imperative is to, in order to successfully kind of engage them, again, you have to understand their top values, their differentiated values. So that's another big imperative that came out. And we have so many beautiful OEs, which is outtakes from the research, that speak to who they are and how they're living these differentiated values as different groups. So the fourth imperative, the second to last one, is to kind of acknowledge the multi-ethnic individuals' dynamic natures and the challenges that are inherent in being multi-ethnic. And Teneshia spoke to this, and so did I, and they often feel like they have to pick a side. And that's not good. We don't want them to have to pick a side. We want brands and companies to recognize them, acknowledge them, celebrate them for their multi-ethnic, kind of natures, and speak to all facets, not just what they look like, and not just those surface level markers. Those just don't work anymore. And then the last one is, and this one is so important, I think, especially when it comes to just Gen Z in general. I speak to a lot of different groups about how to engage Gen Z. And I think a lot of marketers think they're just like millennials, but they are not like millennials. The Gen Zs were raised by a completely different generation of parent. They were raised by the Gen Xers. And so the Gen Zs have this very practical, gritty, courageous attitude about them. They were not kind of helicoptered like the millennials were. So I feel like we need to be a solution to the issues, the brands and companies, to the issues that Generation Self-Defined are going through right now. We need to know what they're fighting for. We need to engage them in the solution, because they rely on brands to build their own brand. They're not terribly brand loyal. It's about brands helping them to be their most authentic selves, and brands can benefit because they do use brands to build their own personas, and they choose brands and companies that reward them based on, stated purpose and who they are and how important they are. So those are sort of the 5 key imperatives. And we've got a lot of data points that are buried in those imperatives in how we built them and how we articulate them.
Teneshia, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, add on before I take us to our next question.
Oh man, as Therese was talking, I am even realizing now just how excited I am about the potential of this research. So everything she said, and I would also add, and this is like going to really more of a tactical level, but I know that we have agency leaders listening, some brand leaders listening. If you were to hear what we're saying and even think about from a tactical approach, how would this show up in some of the day-to-day programming that I'm doing? Number one, with your influencers and or spokespeople and the voices that you are choosing to engage with, to really engage meaningfully with these audiences, you want to make sure you also are now including influencers that resonate with the multi-ethnic, multiracial experiences. Influencers that when this audience hears from them, they will automatically know, like, wow, that's someone that relates to my lived experience. That's someone that really gets this duality of having to go between different worlds quite often. That is a simple way that these consumers will say, oh, they get me, they see me. They're influencers that actually represent the multi-ethnic, multiracial experience. Another thing, we're always sort of assessing the landscape at what are the right multicultural tent poles to show up at. And yes, there's some of the traditional ones that we know to reach Black audiences or Asian Pacific American audiences, but really even looking further at what are some of those multicultural tent poles that are reaching diverse groups. So the culture cons of the world, Afrotech, Afropunk. What are some of the the multi-ethnic and multiracial experiences that you can actually bring up in your programming at these experiences, where this audience member would say, hey, that's someone that created an experience that they pull from sort of my Black experience. They pull from the fact that I'm LGBTQ. They pull from the fact that I'm looking at my identity in this duality in this way. So again, the experiences that we're choosing and how we're showing up there, we can pull this through. Another one is branded content. The content that we're choosing to create, ensuring that this cultural nuance is being pulled through in the content. I think a few shows that are doing this well right now, I just binge watched Jenny in Georgia on Netflix last night. And Jenny is a daughter of a Black father and a white woman. But if you really look at that storyline, she is a prime example of generation self-defined. I don't know how many of you all had an opportunity to watch You People. You People really, really sparked a lot of conversation on social. But again, that was families and cultures that came together, and in some ways they clashed. Two LA millennials from different backgrounds fall in love and face the ultimate relationship test. How will these cultures blend? I think you're going to start seeing more storylines like that in content that's being created. And so, how can your brand play a role in creating that type of content that's really giving a nod to, we realize that multiculturalism in the nation is even becoming more nuanced. From a product perspective, you should be listening to this thinking about, well, how will my products sort of meet the unique needs of these audiences? In a conversation that we had recently, we talked about Mayel as a beauty product that's doing this extremely well. Mayel is really resonating amongst Black audience, Hispanic audience, multi-ethnic audiences. The product is really designed for ethnic hair that is actually, if you go out to social media and you sort of listen to some of the conversations, it's one of the only products that's like a must-have amongst Hispanic audiences, amongst Black audiences, as well as amongst white audiences. And so thinking about the product development and your product story and how will your products uniquely meet the needs. And then the last but not least, I think Therese did an awesome job here, but we know how important purpose-inspired campaigns and having campaigns that are doing meaningful impact in the world. This is extremely important to diverse audiences. Well, that means you're going to have to take the time to understand what are those societal issues that are disproportionately impacting these audiences, and showing up in really meaningful ways will be important. So I'll pause. I know that was a lot. I really tried to just give more tactical ways of thinking, because Therese did such an amazing job at sort of those general high level mandates that we're going to call out. But I know agency leaders are on the phone and want to also pull it through, like, this is what it looks like in our day-to-day work.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And my kind of taking it home question for us today is, and maybe opening a Pandora's box, because it could be probably its own episode, but I'm going to just say, we've talked a lot about how do we tactically engage this audience in particular, how do we apply it into our work? But one of the most effective ways to probably do that is to encourage representation on teams that are doing the work. And so I'm wondering, how do we engage this audience, or this, generation self-defined, to come join our teams, to come work in our offices, to be a part of this? What is the best way to create a space that they also want to work in? And to recruit?
I have an answer for this. I feel like it's really up to companies to authentically engage and empower this generation, to listen to them, to give them a voice. They know a lot. They're so savvy and so filled with another point of view that people have never thought about before. So I think we need to give them voice. We need to partner with them so they realize their potential to inspire and drive positive change, because this is really what they want to do. They live their lives to make the world a better place. And so, it's like, I feel, 69% of this, the young generation, they feel positively about different ethnic and racial groups advocating for one another, both politically and socially. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Megan. You probably are, but the first Gen Z actually is in Congress in Florida, Maxwell Frost. And I was so gratified to see that, because I thought, okay, so now they're going to see themselves in the world as having a voice and being able to use their influence, not from an egoic standpoint at all, because they really truly feel like they have a job to do in life. And their job is to push positive change forward in every aspect of life. So it's our job as companies and brands to help them do that.
Thank you for that. Teneshia, anything to add or?
Well, I think, as an industry, we've talked at length about this over the past couple of years. Some of the things that I'll say we know, but I think they're worth saying again and again. One, I think that's extremely important is creating cultures of belonging. And, as we attempt to become more diverse as an industry, there will have to be intentional focus of looking inward at your culture to say, how do I shape my culture where when we attract this talent truly feels that they belong? I feel there's still a great deal of work in that space. However, we are making some progress, but that's important. It's definitely important if we're going to retain for the long term. The second thing I would say is really, really strive to sort of find what we call at EGAMI as the profession alignment. It's where purpose and profession meets. It's where a career and calling meets. And so you can sort of find those alignments by really sharing what your values are and being intentional to create opportunities of shared values. And so if you look at what are the values of these audiences and you study what are the values of your company, where is there an opportunity for you to create shared values? And where is there an opportunity for you as a company to join forces with this group to live out your values in a way where it's leaving meaningful impact in the world? That's something that this talent will care about. Something else that is important is be transparent and let's keep it real. I think there is almost a sense of skepticism around, is this a real commitment from this company and or not? These are savvy audiences. And they remember that out of the blue in 2020, there were more commitments towards diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts than ever before. Well, as those commitments were made, there is also this sense of who's really, really down for this and or who is, throwing out a number because they don't want to be on a list that you're not doing the right thing. And so making sure that you're being transparent and keeping it real with wherever you may be in your journey, that's going to be important as these younger voices are determining where do we want to contribute our skills and efforts to make a difference. Another thing I would say is create seats at the table for their voices. As an industry, we have to celebrate different ways of thinking, different types of skills, and in doing so, creating that seat for the voices to be heard. As I tell that particular story, I think of Grant, who is a managing director in the Chicago Midwest, but he has a story of a mentee that he works with that is doing a phenomenal job in the Chicago office. But this young man did not come to the table with traditional agency experience. But he is one of the brightest voices that adds so much to the business from cultural insights and lived experiences. And Grant was able to really see, we got to think differently. I got to create a seat at a table so that Q's voice can be heard. That's something that's important if we want to attract these diverse audiences. And then another thing I think we got to be intentional about is showcasing diverse leaders, because people want to see themselves in the industry. So let's showcase our leaders that are doing phenomenal jobs so that this younger generation can see, oh, there's someone there that I can relate to. This is an industry that celebrates me. And those are just some of the ways. The last thing that I would say too is, do not be afraid to create new models. And this is sort of a full circle moment, when Barbie and I sat down, we didn't know what we didn't know. There was just a desire to come together around shared values and shared purpose. And I can truly say, I believe we have created a new model for collaboration for change. And don't be afraid to create new models. And I will say the agency allyship model that EGAMI Group and Zeno Group is currently working under, we've defined it now where 2 or more agencies are aligned in their unwavering and selfless advocacy, focusing on fueling one another to push through and eliminate systemic barriers, collaborating and achieving something better for each other and humankind. We've now taken a look at the model. We're studying the model in an attempt to now give the blueprint of this model to the industry to say, here's how you establish your own agency allyship. And we invite you all to take a look at that once we start sharing the model. But it was a different way of thinking to create diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions in the industry in new ways.
Transparency, keeping it real. Thank you both. This has been just such a phenomenal episode. We have learned so much. There's so much more to continue the discussion around. Thank you for giving us something to think about this week, giving us something to apply. Teneshia Jackson-Warner, Therese Caruso, this has been a really wonderful episode of the PRovoke Media podcast. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you for having us. We really, really enjoyed this conversation. As you can tell, we're passionate about it. You can have us back at any time.
Oh, yes.
And gladly we will do just that. We will take passion any day. So thank you for your work. This has been the PRovoke Media podcast.